Hi, my name is Carol Rizzolo, and this is the first part in a series on teaching the Odyssey of Homer. So a little bit about me. I've taught these courses for several years now. I have a background, my doctorate is in mythology and depth psychology, which means that we really look at some of these ancient stories from the perspective of thousands of years ago. What can we learn? So we know that mythologies tend to be the stories of men. It's where the wisdom of the men is held and kept. So most mythologies are male-driven. There are often women in them, but they're often a bit player. So when we're looking at mythologies, sometimes we learn what's the best way to be a man on a battlefield, what's the right behavior, what's the right guest-host relationship. We'll learn about all sorts of things that our common human ancestors put into story as a way of teaching not only their own children and their civilizations and their families, but really these are the exquisite gifts that we have from antiquity. So for those of you who are saying, well, wait a minute, if the mythologies are the wisdom of the men, what about the wisdom of the women? Wisdom of women is in the fairy tales. Unfortunately, fairy tales are often viewed as stories for children. But actually we had in antiquity, so let's go back thousands of years, we can go back as much as 3,000 years, and we know that the wisdom of the women are home. They're weaving blankets, they're with their children, they're with the young boys and with the girls, and teaching them really what holds community together. So we have any number of fairy tales that teach that. An example of that might be the Cinderella story. The Cinderella story is the story of the envied and the envier. And so that's really, if you can understand what happens when somebody is envying you, or when you're being envied, or when you envied somebody else, you can understand the destructiveness of that, right? So that tends to be the story. The wisdom of the women is in the fairy tales, and I'll speak more about that at another time in another class. But for now, I'm going to stay with the mythology, and I'm going to be even more specific than that, and we're really going to be speaking about Homer's Odyssey. So Homer's Odyssey is believed to have, by scholars, to have been put down into kind of concretized as a single story sometime between 600 and 800 BC. It's referring back to the Trojan War. Trojan War, scholars believe, probably happened around 1200 BC. So what we had the story of the Iliad, which told the story of the Trojan War and the wrath of Achilles, but just for convenience sake at the moment, we are really going to stay with the Odyssey. The Odyssey is the story of the great Odysseus, the wily Odysseus, who we know his backstory a little bit from these other stories that kind of get added into other mythologies. We know bits and pieces of who is Odysseus. And Homer's Odyssey is Odysseus's story. So I'm going to use this book, and we will show that to you in a little while. The reason I particularly like this book, which is the translation by Robert Fagles, is because it's a little bit more poetic. It's a more modern translation. The older translations, it's available widely on the internet. You can download free translations. You can certainly get them from your local library. The older translations were quite literal, so they didn't necessarily capture the poetry of the stories or the lyrical nature of the stories. They really were more, here is a verbatim translation. They're kind of a dry read, and many of us had to read them sometime in high school, but they were pretty dry read. So the more modern translations really capture the idea that these stories were being sung by bards all around the region, and they would captivate audiences. Hundreds and thousands of people would listen to these bards traveling all around the Mediterranean region, singing and telling these stories. Interestingly, we tend to refer to the Odyssey as the Odyssey written by Homer, but we don't really know that there was a Homer. In fact, there's a lot of question about that and a lot of discussion. As it turns out, scholars tend to debate, is there a single Homer or are there many Homers? But what we do know is, once we put together all of the different versions of the Odyssey that are out and about and the different stories that kind of make it a whole story, we know that in all of these verses that are written down and what's translated coming forward tends to be a story brought forward and attributed to a man named Homer. Homer was a blind bard, a Homer who everyone believes did exist, and the one thing they can all agree on is that Homer was blind. So there's a lot of art about that, and I'm hoping to show you quite a bit of that. But we often have an image of a man strumming a lyre and kind of looking up heavenward for inspiration from the muses to tell the story, and to get the inspiration from the gods and from the divine. That's what they understood as to how is the story coming through the man to be told to the audience. So just sort of a sidebar comment about the muses. The way they come into being, so Zeus, we've got the primary god figure of the Olympian gods, and that is Zeus. And he mates with a woman, a goddess, named Mnemosyne. About the muses, because the muses were understood to be the inspiration for any poet of those ages. So we have Zeus, the primary god, who mates with Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, the sacred goddess of memory. And they mate for 9 days in a row, and she gives birth to the 9 muses. The 9 muses would be Harmonia. They're where we get the name of music from, right? So we have the 9 muses, and they are really the muses of the arts and music and story and lyricism, that they are the divine, understood to be the divine inspiration. So anytime we read an epic, certainly from the time of the Greco-Roman era, it often begins with, "Oh, tell me, O muse, of the story," or "Sing to me, O muse." We're really accessing memory through these goddesses of the arts, through the muses. Okay, so we have Homer, who starts this off by saying, "Oh, tell me, O muse, of the story." And now we are about to hear this entirely wonderful story of what becomes of Odysseus. So we've had the Trojan War, and again, I'll teach a course on the Iliad, but so you can have a sense of what was that war, and maybe the thing to do is at least speak a little bit about it now. So the story of the Trojan War is that we have 12 kings all around the region in the Mediterranean. We have 12 kings, and they have all come together. There's the most beautiful woman in the land is Helen. And Helen is deciding, her father is deciding who should she marry. And there's this big competition between all of these kings of the area as to who is the best one for Helen to marry. And given that she is the most beautiful woman in all of the world, there's a question now of whoever wins this contest, will the other kings consider that marriage sacred, and will they uphold the promise to keep it sacred and to do anything for it? After all these competitions and the contests happen, Menelaus wins Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, as his wife. The other kings are all together, and Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, says, "Okay, this is what we're going to need to do. We all need to make a promise to hold that marriage sacred. No matter what happens, we will all come together to fight for the sacred nature of that marriage." So they all go back to their places. They all live wherever they're living in their different kingdoms. And Menelaus is more than happy to go home and be with Helen, his beautiful wife. At some point, we have a wedding that happens. The wedding, so part of what happens with a lot of these stories in Greek mythology is we have several things happening in different places at different times. So for the moment, I need for you to just put Menelaus and Helen happily living over here as the king and queen, and all of the other kings have gone home. Meantime, we have a wedding occurring. The wedding is of King Peleus and Thetis. She's a sea nymph. It is a wonderful wedding. Everybody's been invited. It is an incredible celebration. There's a lot of artwork of the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. Peleus is spelled P-E-L-E-U-S. Certainly you can Google that. You can look it up in the library or in an art history book. There are tons of images, stunning images of the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. So they invite everybody to the wedding to celebrate, except one person. They don't invite Eris, E-R-I-S. She is the divine goddess of discord, and who wants discord in the marriage? So they don't invite her. But as all things happen, when you don't invite that person, they show up at the wedding. So Eris shows up. She's created a golden apple, she's got a golden apple. It's a golden apple of the Hesperides, which is a golden apple from the very ends of the earth. She is holding the golden apple. She puts a note on it that says, "To the fairest of them all." And she pitches this golden apple right into the middle of the wedding ceremony. And we have three goddesses who fight for it, because to the fairest of them all would be Athena, our goddess of tactical strategy. She's an incredible strategist. She's tactical. She's often mistaken as the goddess of war, but that's not the case. She's always in full armor, but she's not the goddess of war. She's actually extremely strategic. So we've got Athena. We have Hera, who is married to Zeus, and so she's kind of the queen of heaven. She's really the most high, but for her, marriage is absolutely sacred. She's understood to be the sacred goddess of marriage. And the third one is Aphrodite. Aphrodite, the most beautiful and the goddess of love. So the three goddesses in the middle of this wedding ceremony start tangling it up, trying to get this golden apple. And they all say, well, to the fairest of them all, that must be for me. But of course, who's going to decide this, right? I mean, any man or god in their right mind is not going to get in the middle of these three goddesses. They're all beautiful. They all have wonderful attributes. And so Peleus and Zeus, the king Peleus and the divine, kind of the supreme god of heavens, says, okay, listen, there is this guy named Paris. He's a shepherder. He's over on a mountain over there. And if you three take the apple to him, we know that he will be able to judge this contest fairly, because he's been judging sheep and animals fairly forever. So we know he's young, he's virile, he's smart, he's a fair judge. You three goddesses, go to him with your apple and see who he chooses. Talk about another place where there's a ton of artwork. This is the judgment of Paris. He's usually imaged as a young, very beautiful young man in the peak of health, and these three gorgeous goddesses appear, and basically there's usually an apple in front of them. So what can they offer him? Each one is trying to get Paris's affection. So Hera says, if you choose me, you'll have dominion over everything. After all, I'm the queen of heaven, I'm married to Zeus, and I'll give you everything. And then Athena says, well, if you choose me, you'll win every war, every battle you ever enter into. You will always win. Marry wisdom and strategy, and that's us. Well, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, says, well, if you choose me, you get the most beautiful woman in the world. You get to choose. Who is the most beautiful woman in the world, and you want to marry her, she's yours. Well, you can imagine a mid-20s young man being offered the opportunity to have the wife as the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chooses for Aphrodite. That sets up a lot of what we're going to be listening to as to who does Athena side with in the Trojan War, who does Hera side with in the Trojan War, and who does Aphrodite side with. So Paris says, oh, I know who I want, Helen of Troy. Well, Helen, not Helen of Troy. She's still Spartan at that point. Paris, it turns out, is a prince of Troy. He didn't know that. He was raised elsewhere outside of Troy under a different name. But he says, I want Helen. She's beautiful. She's actually the daughter of Zeus. She is a beautiful woman. And Aphrodite says, done. Go to Menelaus, go to Helen, go get her. So the problem here is that you have all of these kings who have agreed that they will all fight for the sanctity of the marriage of Helen to Menelaus. But Paris, this young kind of cocky guy, some painters paint this as the abduction and rape of Helen. Other painters paint it as Helen saying, yeah, baby, I am on my way. This guy is gorgeous, and I'm married to an old red-headed coot who's kind of, Menelaus is always described as kind of gruff and certainly not physically appealing. So Paris goes, he gets Helen, and Paris then takes her back to Troy. He now learns who he actually is. He learns he's the Prince of Troy. Aphrodite lets them know that, and Paris and Helen now go to Troy and find sanctity there with King Priam and Queen Hecuba. So they are in a walled city of Troy. So what's the problem here, right? The problem here is Menelaus is furious. He's been embarrassed. He's spurned. His brother Agamemnon says, well, we are going to lead the armies to fight against you, and we are going to go get Helen back. So all of the armies come together. So why do they care? They actually don't care. But what they do care about is their own honor. Their kleos, it's called, K-L-E-O-S. They care about their honor because they've all promised that if this marriage wasn't held as sanctified and intact, that they would all go back and get her. So their honor, their word, these are all men of honor, they're all kings. So they now have to come. Many of them do come together, and we'll kind of speak about the names of who's gathered. You'll know some of the names for sure, like Achilles is a king. He's one of the people who's there. And Odysseus doesn't want any part of going. He knows he's king of Ithaca, he's in Ithaca. His wife Penelope is there, his child Telemachus is there as an infant. His father Laertes is there with his mom. We've got a lovely setting. Odysseus just wants to stay home. And so we have two messengers who come and say, okay, the war is on, we've got to go to Troy and get Helen back. Odysseus, wily and cunning are some of the words used to describe him, and Odysseus hooks up two different animals to a plow, two mismatched animals to a plow. He gets in and he starts plowing like a crazy man all over the fields. The furrows are going everywhere. He's acting like he's crazy. His wife Penelope is holding Telemachus, the infant, watching all of this. Well, the messengers and the kings don't believe that Odysseus is really nuts, so they decide to test him. And what they do is they grab the baby and they throw the baby down in front of the plow, and Odysseus pulls up short. He won't run over the baby. And they say, we knew you were trying to fake us out. We knew you weren't crazy. Suit up, get your army. And off goes Odysseus, leaving behind his infant son and his beautiful wife, his family, and he leaves, and they all end up now, Odysseus with all of his Ithacan army, go there, and they're all now on Aulis, on this island. They're on this island, the winds die. They can't actually, they're right across the straits from Troy, but they can't get there because the winds die. Turns out that they've angered the goddess. Agamemnon has angered the goddess. And in angering the goddess, they've angered Artemis. And in angering Artemis, Artemis says, okay, I'm going to kill all the wind. You guys are stuck there. Oh, well. And so Agamemnon and his brother Menelaus are together. Agamemnon's being given the role of commander over all of the Greeks. They're also called the Achaeans, but this is an entire amassed Greek army that's now going to go storm Troy. So they're all on Aulis. That's A-U-L-I-S. They're all on Aulis when the winds die. Menelaus and Agamemnon send a prophet to figure out, basically a seer, to figure out why the winds die. And that's when they learn that Artemis is angry. There are several different stories of why would Artemis be angry, but basically what Artemis says through this prophet is Agamemnon has to slaughter his firstborn daughter in order to make things right and for the winds to blow. Well, the daughter is at home, and the daughter is with the mother. The mother is Clytemnestra. So if you know the story of the Oresteia, you'll know these names are familiar. So Clytemnestra and Helen are actually sisters. They're half-sisters. Clytemnestra is born of a human man, a human father, where Helen is born of Zeus. But the mother is the same. So we have, so what Agamemnon does after struggling a lot is he sends for his daughter Iphigenia. And this is another place where there's phenomenal artwork. Clytemnestra brings Iphigenia to Aulis, and it's all under a ruse. Agamemnon has said, oh, you're going to come and you're going to marry Achilles, prepare for a wedding. It's going to be wonderful. Everybody is here. It's going to be beautiful. Prepare your daughter for marriage. Well, what's actually happening is Clytemnestra does bring the daughter, and Agamemnon then explains why he's brought them here. So you might think Agamemnon is just being a creep, and he isn't really being lovely anyway, but what's happened is he's really struggling. Iphigenia is his favorite daughter, firstborn, everything is all about this beautiful daughter. But now the men are saying, listen, if you don't kill her, we're going to go get her and kill her because we're all ready to go to Troy. We're sitting here in Aulis. The goddess has told you to slaughter this girl. And so he's really up against a rock and a hard place. He can't go against all of the men who are there and all of the kings because they'll kill him and then they'll kill her. And so there's, again, a lot of artwork about his sad struggle. But ultimately, Iphigenia, who is about the age of Isaac, of Abraham and Isaac, Iphigenia is somewhere around 12. Clytemnestra does bring her. They learn the real reason is that Iphigenia is to be sacrificed. Iphigenia at first begs for forgiveness, says, no, 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 don't do this to me. And then she says, I am going to do this for my country. I will go ahead with it. If this is what will help the Greeks, I'll do it. And she bravely walks up to the altar. She gets to the altar. All of the men in the military, all of these army, they can't tolerate this. Achilles is angry because he's been the ruse as to why is she coming. It was sort of this ruse of a marriage to Achilles. But Iphigenia walks up to the altar. All of the men put their head down. They hear the chop come down. They look up. Iphigenia has disappeared, and there's a stag there in her place. She's been rescued by Artemis. There are several plays that kind of tell the story of Iphigenia at Aulis, and then Iphigenia at Taurus, of what becomes of her. But she's been rescued by Artemis, the goddess. It's a very similar story, interestingly, to Abraham and Isaac, that the child is not sacrificed. Suddenly the winds pick back up again, and all of the armies take off, and they take off for Troy to get Helen back. That's why Helen is referred to as the face that launched 1,000 ships, because we have all of these ships now leaving Aulis, heading for Troy. I'm going to stop there, and we will pick up on the other side of that. Thanks.